People like her always believe the fire is the end of the story, but sometimes it's only the moment the truth begins. The smell of wet ash hit me before I even stepped out of my truck. It clung to the cold morning air, mixing with the bitter scent of burned cedar and melted paint until every breath tasted like yesterday's memories. My house wasn't standing anymore. What had been a quiet two-story home on the edge of Willow Creek Estates was now nothing more than a blackened frame surrounded by yellow tape, flashing emergency lights, and neighbors whispering behind coffee cups like they were watching someone else's tragedy unfold. I stood there without saying a word. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I walked closer, each step carrying me toward what used to be the front porch where my father and I had spent countless Saturday mornings drinking coffee before sunrise. The old oak tree beside the driveway still stood untouched, its branches reaching over the ruins as if it refused to believe the house beneath it was gone. That tree had watched 3 generations of my family come and go. Now I was watching strangers point cameras at the place where our lives had been. Across the street, standing beside her spotless white luxury SUV with perfectly pressed clothes and sunglasses that hid whatever she might have been thinking, was Linda Whitmore, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. She folded her arms, tilted her head slightly, and offered the kind of smile that never reached a person's eyes. It wasn't relief. It wasn't sympathy. It looked more like satisfaction. As firefighters rolled up another hose and investigators quietly marked the perimeter, Linda spoke just loudly enough for me to hear. "Such a terrible accident," she said. "Sometimes neglected properties become dangerous for everyone." Her perfume drifted across the breeze, even through the lingering smoke, sharp enough to cut through the smell of burned lumber. I looked at her for only a second before turning back toward what remained of my home. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse her. I didn't ask why she seemed so calm, while everyone else stared in disbelief. I simply watched. An investigator kneeled beside the driveway and placed something carefully into an evidence bag. Most people expected anger. Some probably expected tears. Instead, I memorized every sound around me. The quiet click of a camera shutter, the low hum of a generator, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the slow scrape of an evidence marker sliding across concrete. Every detail mattered. Every second mattered. Linda seemed almost disappointed that I wasn't giving her the reaction she wanted. She adjusted her sunglasses, glanced toward the other board members gathering near the sidewalk, and walked away with the confidence of someone who believed the hardest part was already behind her. She had no idea that this morning wasn't the conclusion she imagined. She thought she was leaving behind a man who had just lost everything. She didn't realize she would be walking into my courtroom exactly 1 week later, carrying far more than confidence with her. I have always believed that a person's real life is measured by what remains after everything comfortable disappears. As the last fire engine rolled away and the flashing lights faded into the gray afternoon, I asked the investigator for permission to walk the property. He gave a quiet nod after reminding me to avoid the marked areas. The air still carried the damp weight of smoke, and every step stirred tiny clouds of ash that settled back onto the cracked concrete like black snow. My name is Nathan Cole. I am 46 years old, and until a few months ago, almost nobody in Willow Creek Estates knew anything about me beyond the fact that I kept my lawn trimmed, waved politely at neighbors, and rarely attended homeowners association meetings. That anonymity was intentional. After more than 15 years serving on the federal bench, I learned that the quieter my private life remained, the safer everyone around me would be. My work belonged inside a courtroom, not at neighborhood barbecues or community gossip circles. Even the moving company that brought my furniture here never knew what I did for a living. They simply saw another middle-aged man settling into an older home that needed a little attention. What they could not see was what that house actually meant. My parents bought it in 1984 with money they spent nearly 20 years saving. My father worked as a civil engineer for the county, and my mother taught 4th grade at the local elementary school for almost 3 decades. Every floorboard carried the sound of birthdays, Thanksgiving dinners, and quiet Sunday mornings when the smell of pancakes drifted through open windows while baseball played softly on the radio. Even after they were gone, I never considered selling it. Some places are worth more than the numbers on a real estate listing. They become proof that honest people existed before us and hoped we would take care of what they left behind. I bent down beside what remained of the fireplace and brushed away a layer of soot until I found a small bronze pocket watch. The glass was cracked beyond repair, and the leather chain had burned away, but the engraved initials of my grandfather were still visible beneath the soot. I slipped it carefully into my coat pocket. Nearby, buried beneath collapsed beams, I spotted the head of my father's old framing hammer. The wooden handle was gone, but the worn steel head felt surprisingly cool against my hand despite everything it had endured. I wrapped it in a clean cloth from my truck before placing it beside the watch. Those two objects were not valuable because of money. They were reminders that memory survives in unexpected ways. As I stood back up, my phone vibrated with another notification from the Homeowners Association. The subject line read, "Property Maintenance Compliance Following Fire Incident." I looked across the street where Linda Whitmore's immaculate lawn looked untouched by the smoke drifting through the neighborhood. I almost smiled. Some people rush to control the story before the facts have a chance to speak. Others wait patiently because they know evidence has a habit of finding its own voice. By the following morning, the smell of smoke had settled into my jacket so deeply that even fresh air could not wash it away. I parked beside the temporary storage unit where the salvage company had delivered the few items that survived, signed a clipboard, and quietly sorted through labeled plastic containers while the metallic rattle of rolling doors echoed across the lot. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. Another electronic notice from the Homeowners Association. Then another. Then a third. Linda Whitmore clearly believed that paperwork could bury reality if she generated enough of it. The first demanded that the burned structure be removed within 10 days because it created an unacceptable visual impact on neighborhood property values. The second warned me that failure to maintain landscaping after the fire could result in daily fines. The third informed me that the monthly association meeting would include discussion of emergency action concerning my lot. Reading them almost felt surreal. Less than 24 hours had passed since firefighters left the scene, yet the greatest concern of the Homeowners Association appeared to be the appearance of blackened brick rather than the family home that had just been lost. That was Linda's style. She ruled Willow Creek Estates with perfectly written letters, carefully rehearsed smiles, and the unwavering confidence of someone who believed nobody would ever challenge her authority. Over the past several months, I had quietly watched her operate. She knew every bylaw by memory, quoted sections without looking at the handbook, and spoke during meetings as though every sentence carried the weight of state law. New homeowners admired her efficiency until they became the target of it. Retirees feared receiving certified envelopes. Young families whispered about unexpected fines for mailbox colors, flower beds, basketball hoops, or holiday decorations left out one day too long. Even contractors lowered their voices whenever her white sport utility vehicle rolled slowly through the neighborhood streets. One afternoon shortly after I moved in, I watched her lecture an elderly veteran because his American flag had become faded after months beneath the Texas sun. The man apologized while standing beside a cane, promising he would replace it by the weekend. Linda accepted the apology with a polite smile that somehow felt colder than an actual argument. That was the moment I understood her greatest talent. She almost never raised her voice. She made other people feel guilty for simply existing outside her definition of perfection. My own disagreements with her had started quietly. She wanted me to remove the old oak tree because falling leaves occasionally drifted onto the sidewalk. She insisted my mailbox did not match the newest neighborhood design, even though it fully complied with county regulations. She suggested I replace the original brick exterior because modern buyers preferred lighter colors. Each time I thanked her for the recommendation and declined without emotion. The more calmly I responded, the more determined she became. Looking back, I realized she was never really interested in my property. She wanted obedience. My refusal to surrender simple decisions without a fight challenged the image she had built for years. Late that afternoon, I drove back toward the neighborhood to collect another box from the garage foundation. Linda stood across the street speaking with 3 board members, occasionally glancing toward my lot before lowering her voice again. When she noticed me, the conversation stopped immediately. She offered another flawless smile and gave a small wave that looked friendly enough for anyone watching from a distance. I returned the gesture with the same quiet expression I had always worn. Neither of us spoke. Sometimes silence reveals far more than conversation ever could, and in that moment, I could almost feel the next move already taking shape. The next 3 days settled into a rhythm that felt almost too quiet. Every morning I arrived before sunrise, unlocked the temporary chain across the driveway, and spent a few hours cataloging whatever could still be recovered. The cool morning air carried the scent of damp earth mixed with lingering smoke, while mockingbirds perched on the old oak tree as though nothing unusual had happened. Around 8 o'clock, the neighborhood slowly came alive. Garage doors groaned open, sprinklers hissed across perfectly trimmed lawns, and luxury sport utility vehicles rolled toward the front entrance one after another. Life continued exactly as it always had. For everyone except me. Linda Whitmore made certain I noticed that fact. She began walking past my property almost every morning with 2 members of the Homeowners Association board, clipboards tucked beneath their arms as though they were conducting official inspections. They stopped just long enough to jot down notes before continuing down the sidewalk. By the second day, another certified notice appeared in my mailbox informing me that debris visible from the street violated community appearance standards. On the third day, I received notice of proposed daily penalties if reconstruction plans were not submitted immediately, despite the ongoing insurance investigation. It became obvious that Linda was trying to create pressure from every possible direction. What surprised me was not her persistence, but how carefully everything was timed. Each notice arrived only hours after another insurance adjuster visited the property or another county investigator completed an inspection. Someone inside the neighborhood seemed unusually well informed about official activity. That detail stayed with me. Late Wednesday afternoon, I met with my insurance examiner, Rebecca Harmon, beside the remains of the garage foundation. She carried a thick folder, wore heavy work boots already covered in ash, and asked practical questions without unnecessary sympathy. As we reviewed photographs, she paused beside the electrical panel and frowned. She crouched quietly, studying several components before taking additional close-up pictures with a professional camera. She did not explain what she had noticed, but I recognized the expression of someone who had just found something that deserved a second look. Before leaving, she simply said, "Please do not remove anything else until our forensics specialist finishes tomorrow." Her tone remained calm, yet it carried enough weight that I understood this investigation was moving in a direction she had not expected. That evening, I returned to the neighborhood just before sunset to collect one last storage container. Warm orange lights stretched across the empty lot, and the breeze carried the familiar scent of fresh-cut grass from neighboring yards. Across the street, Linda was hosting several board members on her front patio. Crystal glasses reflected the fading sunlight, while relaxed laughter drifted across the road. The conversation stopped the instant my truck entered the driveway. Linda raised her glass slightly with another polished smile that seemed carefully designed for witnesses. "I hope everything is moving along," she called pleasantly. "The neighborhood is eager to see progress." I thanked her just as politely and continued unloading my supplies. From the corner of my eye, I noticed one of the board members lean toward her and whisper something that immediately changed her expression. For the briefest second, the confidence disappeared. She reached into her purse, checked her phone, and quickly excused herself before walking inside without another word. It lasted no more than 5 seconds, but after months of watching Linda control every room she entered, I recognized genuine surprise when I saw it. Whatever message had appeared on that screen was unexpected, and for the first time since the fire, I began to suspect that events were no longer unfolding according to her plan. I slept well that night for the first time since the fire, not because I had found answers, but because unanswered questions often reveal more than rushed conclusions. Thursday morning arrived with a thin layer of fog hanging over Willow Creek Estates, softening the outlines of rooftops while the scent of fresh coffee drifted from nearby kitchens. I parked beside the old oak tree just as the insurance forensics specialist arrived in an unmarked pickup truck carrying several hard cases filled with equipment. His name was Daniel Mercer, a quiet investigator with silver hair and the patient habits of someone who trusted evidence more than opinions. He shook my hand, glanced over the property once, and immediately began photographing details that most people would never notice. Burn patterns, wiring, foundation cracks, fragments of melted fixtures. He measured distances with a steel tape, labeled samples with precise handwriting, and rarely spoke except to ask simple factual questions. Nearly 3 hours passed before he finally removed his gloves and looked toward me. "Mr. Cole," he said calmly, "I cannot give you final conclusions today, but I can tell you this was not consistent with the accidental electrical failures I usually investigate." He stopped there, refusing to speculate further, but he did not need to say another word. The silence that followed carried far more weight than a lengthy explanation ever could. As he packed his equipment, another county vehicle entered the street. A deputy fire marshal stepped out carrying additional documents and quietly joined the discussion. Neither man appeared interested in the homeowners association notices that continued arriving in my mailbox. They cared only about facts. That difference mattered. Shortly after noon, my telephone rang. The caller identified herself as Melissa Grant from the county records office. She explained that someone had submitted an expedited request earlier that week seeking copies of historical permits, ownership records, and zoning documents related to my property. Because I was the legal owner, state procedure required notifying me that those records had been accessed. I thanked her and politely asked who submitted the request. After a brief pause, she answered that the request had come from legal counsel representing the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. That surprised me less than the timing. Linda was searching county archives while publicly insisting everything had been an unfortunate accident. People who feel completely secure rarely spend money digging through decades of public records. I made a quiet note of it before ending the call. Later that afternoon, I stopped by a small diner about 5 miles outside the neighborhood. The familiar smell of grilled onions and fresh pie filled the room as local conversations drifted between booths. I had barely taken my first sip of black coffee when someone approached my table. It was George Ellis, a retired building inspector who had lived in Willow Creek Estates since the subdivision first opened. We had spoken only a handful of times before. He glanced toward the windows to make certain nobody from the neighborhood was nearby before lowering his voice. "Nathan," he said carefully, "there are people who have wanted that corner lot for years. Your house was the only original property left that interrupted their redevelopment plans." He slid a folded newspaper clipping across the table before standing up. "You did not get this from me." Then he quietly paid his check and walked out. I unfolded the clipping and immediately recognized Linda smiling beside a conceptual drawing of an expanded neighborhood entrance proposed almost 2 years earlier. My property sat directly in the center of the illustration. For the first time since the fire, separate pieces that had seemed unrelated began fitting together with unsettling precision. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and the kind of crisp air that usually made the neighborhood feel peaceful. Instead, Willow Creek Estates buzzed with unusual energy as homeowners gathered outside the clubhouse for the monthly association meeting. Golf carts rolled slowly across the parking lot, coffee cups steamed in the cool breeze, and quiet conversations floated through the air like everyone expected another routine discussion about landscaping and budget reports. I parked near the back, locked my truck, and walked toward the entrance carrying nothing but a slim leather folder. Several neighbors offered polite nods. Others looked away, uncertain how to speak to someone whose home had disappeared only days before. Linda Whitmore stood near the front doors greeting residents with practiced warmth, wearing a navy blazer with the Homeowners Association logo embroidered above the pocket. Her smile returned the moment she noticed me. "Nathan," she said brightly, "I appreciate you coming. I hope today we can finally discuss the future of your property." Her words sounded courteous enough for everyone nearby to hear, yet there was something unmistakably confident beneath them. She believed this meeting would move the neighborhood one step closer to removing the last obstacle standing in the way of her redevelopment plans. I thanked her for the invitation and quietly took a seat near the back of the room. The meeting began exactly on schedule. Financial reports, landscaping updates, maintenance contracts. Everything unfolded with mechanical precision until Linda reached the final agenda item. She stood, adjusted a stack of papers, and projected an architectural rendering onto the large screen behind her. My property appeared at the center of the image, replaced by an expanded decorative entrance, additional visitor parking, and a landscaped green space complete with fountains and walking paths. Several homeowners murmured with surprise. Linda explained that the recent fire presented what she called an unexpected opportunity to improve neighborhood value through thoughtful long-term planning. She spoke confidently about efficiency, modernization, and community vision, carefully avoiding any suggestion that the proposal had existed long before the fire itself. I listened without interruption. Then one homeowner in the second row raised his hand. "Has the owner agreed to sell?" Linda smiled without hesitation. "Discussions are progressing," she answered. "We are optimistic that practical solutions will prevail." I almost admired how effortlessly she transformed assumptions into apparent facts. Before anyone could ask another question, the clubhouse doors opened, and a uniformed county deputy stepped inside, carrying a large sealed envelope. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the ceiling fans overhead. The deputy walked directly to Linda and politely asked her to acknowledge receipt of official documents regarding an active investigation. Confusion spread across her face for only a moment before she forced another smile and accepted the envelope. Several board members leaned toward her as she opened it. I watched the color slowly leave her expression while she scanned the first page. She quickly folded the documents closed and attempted to continue the meeting, but her voice no longer carried the same certainty. Homeowners exchanged puzzled glances. Someone quietly asked whether everything was all right. Linda answered that it was merely routine administrative correspondence, yet her hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she gathered her papers. I remained seated without speaking. There was no satisfaction in that moment, only quiet confirmation that the investigation had begun moving beyond speculation. For the first time since the fire, Linda Whitmore no longer looked like the person controlling the room. She looked like someone who had just realized the story she intended to write was being rewritten by facts she could no longer manage. I spent the next several days exactly the way I had spent most of my professional life, saying very little while everyone else talked far too much. Every letter from the Homeowners Association went into a labeled folder. Every electronic notice was downloaded, printed, and stored with the original email headers. Every conversation happened through documented channels. Years in the legal system had taught me that memories fade, emotions change, but records remain exactly as they were created. Monday morning, I met with investigators at the county administration building. The hallway smelled faintly of fresh floor polish and old paper, while fluorescent lights reflected off polished tile with almost clinical precision. Detective Laura Simmons greeted me with a firm handshake and spread several photographs across the conference table. Most showed details I had already seen at the property, but a few were entirely new. One image captured tire impressions near the side access road that had not belonged to emergency vehicles. Another showed a damaged security camera mounted on a neighboring utility pole. The camera itself had stopped recording before the fire, but its internal system had automatically transmitted maintenance alerts with exact timestamps to the county network. Those alerts established a timeline investigators had not expected to recover. Detective Simmons never accused anyone. She simply asked careful questions while writing neat notes in a leather notebook. By the end of the meeting, I understood something important. The investigation was no longer searching for a possible explanation. It was testing competing theories against objective evidence. Later that afternoon, Rebecca Harmon called with an update from the insurance company. Their forensic review had ruled out several common accidental causes, and additional specialists had been assigned to examine financial records connected to recent redevelopment proposals affecting the neighborhood. That last sentence immediately caught my attention. Insurance companies rarely expand investigations without a practical reason. Someone had found enough information to justify looking beyond the damaged structure itself. As I drove back toward Willow Creek Estates, the late afternoon sun reflected across rows of identical windows, making the entire subdivision appear calm and untouched. Yet beneath that polished appearance, conversations had clearly changed. Neighbors who once hurried indoors now stood quietly at the ends of driveways, speaking in low voices. Curtains moved whenever unfamiliar county vehicles entered the subdivision. Even Linda's usual morning patrols had stopped. Her white sport utility vehicle remained parked outside her house far more often than before. 2 evenings later, another unexpected phone call arrived. George Ellis asked if we could meet again at the same diner. He looked noticeably more serious than before. After waiting until the waitress refilled our coffee, he slid a small flash drive across the table. "This belonged to a contractor who retired last year," he said quietly. He kept digital copies of planning presentations because he never trusted people to remember what they promised. I asked no unnecessary questions. George simply nodded toward the drive. You should let the investigators decide whether it matters. When I returned home to my temporary apartment, I delivered the drive directly to Detective Simmons without opening a single file. That decision surprised her. She asked whether I wanted to know what was inside. I answered honestly that curiosity had never been as valuable as preserving the integrity of evidence. She smiled for the first time since we had met and carefully logged the device into evidence. As I walked back into the evening air, I realized something else had quietly changed. For days I had been reacting to events that seemed beyond my control. Now the facts were beginning to move under their own momentum, carried not by anger or speculation, but by patient people doing their jobs exactly as they were trained to do. And experience had taught me that once the truth develops that kind of momentum, it becomes remarkably difficult to stop. The following Monday began before sunrise, and the courthouse looked exactly as it always had. Solid limestone walls glowing beneath the first light, while the American flag moved gently above the entrance in the cool morning breeze. I arrived through the employee entrance carrying the same worn leather briefcase I had used for years, nodded to the security officers who greeted me by name, and walked quietly toward my chambers. The familiar scent of polished wood and fresh coffee replaced the lingering smell of smoke that had followed me for days. My judicial robe hung exactly where I had left it before taking emergency leave after the fire. I brushed a small trace of dust from one sleeve, placed it over my shoulders, and reviewed the morning docket with the same discipline that had guided every working day of my career. Several civil matters were scheduled before noon, followed by an administrative hearing connected to multiple county filings involving Willow Creek Estates. I had already disclosed my personal circumstances through the proper judicial ethics process, and the administrative assignment had been transferred according to established court procedures. My responsibility that morning was simply to perform the duties assigned to me until another judge formally assumed the related matters. At precisely 9 o'clock, the courtroom doors opened and attorneys, clerks, and members of the public quietly filled the gallery. The steady rustle of legal pads and case files echoed beneath the high ceiling as everyone settled into place. A few minutes later, the courtroom deputy announced the next matter, and several additional observers entered through the rear doors. Among them was Linda Whitmore. She wore another perfectly tailored suit, carried an expensive leather portfolio, and walked with the same measured confidence I had watched for months at neighborhood meetings. She was speaking softly with the attorney beside her and never once looked toward the bench. The courtroom deputy called for all to rise. The room became perfectly still except for the soft scrape of chairs moving across the polished floor. I entered from the side door and took my seat behind the bench. For one brief moment, Linda continued organizing papers without looking up. Then she heard my voice as I greeted everyone and called the session to order. Her head lifted almost instantly. The confidence disappeared before she could hide it. Her eyes widened just enough to reveal genuine surprise as she stared toward the bench, clearly trying to reconcile the quiet neighbor she believed she understood with the federal judge now presiding before her. She did not speak. Neither did I. Courtrooms are not places for personal reactions. They are places for procedure, neutrality, and the rule of law. I continued exactly as I always had, addressing counsel, confirming appearances, and maintaining the record without acknowledging anything beyond the case before the court. Yet the atmosphere had changed. Several attorneys noticed Linda's expression. The clerk glanced briefly in her direction before returning to the docket. Even the quiet scratching of pens seemed louder than before. Linda lowered her eyes to the papers in front of her, but her hands no longer moved with the certainty I had seen so many times inside the neighborhood clubhouse. For months, she had assumed she knew exactly who I was because she had judged me by appearances, routine, and silence. She had never imagined that the man she tried to pressure with notices, deadlines, and neighborhood authority spent every working day inside a courtroom where decisions depended not on influence or confidence, but on evidence, credibility, and the patient discipline of the law. I left the courtroom that afternoon through the same quiet hallway I had walked for years, but the weight I carried felt different. Not lighter, just clearer. The investigation continued exactly as it should, handled by professionals whose responsibility was to follow evidence wherever it led rather than wherever rumors pointed. Over the following weeks, county officials, insurance investigators, and financial auditors completed their reviews. Documents that had once existed only as scattered pieces slowly formed a complete picture. Redevelopment proposals, internal correspondence, archive planning presentations, financial records, and witness statements all fit together with a precision that no single person could have created alone. Several administrative actions were taken against members of the Homeowners Association Board, and the organization itself entered a lengthy process of restructuring under newly elected leadership. Linda Whitmore was no longer the unquestioned voice of the neighborhood. The confidence that had once filled every meeting disappeared as objective records replaced assumptions and independent investigators answered questions that private opinions never could. I never celebrated any of it. Courtrooms had taught me that accountability is not entertainment. It is responsibility. By early autumn, the temporary fencing around my property finally came down. The first trucks delivering fresh lumber arrived just after sunrise, their diesel engines rumbling softly across the gravel driveway, while the smell of clean pine replaced the scent of smoke that had lingered for months. I stood beneath the old oak tree holding my grandfather's restored pocket watch in one hand and the refinished steel head of my father's framing hammer in the other. Skilled craftsmen measured twice before making each cut, just as my father had always taught me. Every new wall rose exactly where the old one had stood, not because I wanted to erase the past, but because I wanted to honor it. One afternoon, the retired building inspector, George Ellis, stopped by carrying 2 cups of black coffee. We leaned against the new porch railing without saying much as the sound of hammers echoed through the neighborhood. After several quiet minutes, he smiled and said, "Looks like the house found its way home." I looked across the street where children were riding bicycles without fear of someone measuring every inch of their front lawns. Neighbors actually paused to talk with one another instead of rushing indoors before another inspection notice appeared. The subdivision felt different, not because every problem had disappeared, but because people had remembered that communities work best when respect replaces intimidation. Before George left, I carefully mounted my father's restored hammer inside the garage and placed my grandfather's pocket watch in a small glass display above the workbench. Neither item looked perfect anymore. Both carried scars that would never disappear. Somehow that made them more valuable than before. Every morning since then, when I unlock the front door and hear the familiar creak of the hardwood floor beneath my boots, I remember that houses can be rebuilt, records can uncover the truth, and patience often accomplishes what anger never could. People sometimes mistake silence for weakness because they assume the quietest person in the room has the least power. My experience has taught me the opposite. The strongest foundation is rarely the loudest one. It is the one built carefully enough to remain standing after every storm has passed. Justice does not need to raise its voice. It simply waits until the facts are ready, and when that day arrives, it does exactly what it was designed to do.